If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters. Whoa, this land.
So welcome everyone. We're so glad you came to the session. We're having a couple of challenges with our team. So we're going to have Ife Kilimanjaro from the Eastern Michigan Environmental Action Council, but one of her colleagues who does the food justice work, Charity, was also here on another panel and missed her panel because she got hit by a car. Oh, geez. So she was sitting on a bus or standing at a bus stop, and a SUV jumped the curb and hit her and another fellow. And but this was yesterday morning at 8:30 in the morning, and she hasn't woken up yet. She's so it's kind of a rough situation. So Ife stayed overnight with her because she didn't know anyone else in New York, and so she was just with her, and her husband's coming in today, but Ife just didn't feel like she could leave her by herself, even though she isn't awake, but just in case she woke up and just so she could be with her. So we have a smaller team. And then at the same time, I'm having a little situation myself in that a friend of mine suddenly lost his mother. So a long story with that. But that's all to say that we probably will try to go until 1:30 instead of 1:50, just because of the many things that are going on. If that works for everyone. So thank you all for your understanding of that situation. So, without further ado, we again welcome you to the panel. We have on our panel Elizabeth Yeampierre, who is with UPROSE in Brooklyn, and Lilian Molina, who is with Greenpeace, as well as just being a fantastic organizer all around, even outside of the Greenpeace context. And I'm Jacqueline Patterson, the Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP. So I am very honored to sit on a panel with two such awesome organizers who are legends in their respective ways, and as part of the collective movement. And we, as per the description, we'll be talking about the intersection of race, class, and we'll also be talking a little bit about gender, even though we didn't explicitly name it, and really the implications for movement building in terms of impact and in terms of role, in terms of leadership in the movement and engagement across different movements. So we have a few framing questions that we're going to use for the discussion, and given that Ife isn't here, I might contribute a little bit more than I had planned to, as a moderator. But we'll see. So I will, for transparency's sake, give you all a sense of what the framing questions will be in advance, and then I will just start to go through them. My computer is the slowest computer on earth. The session before ours went on a little bit longer, so we didn't get in here until a couple of minutes, until 11:53, so I didn't get to open up my document here. Okay, sorry, it's moving across. Hopefully leave it any minute now. Oh, do? Okay. Okay. Yeah, they're still coming. Okay, so I gotta put them aside. So our questions are, first of all, actually, since we're a smaller group too, we might do intros across the room, not just the panel. So we'll do intros, and then the opening questions for our panelists is how and why they came to this work, and then they'll provide an overview of their work. We'll talk about how the intersectionality frame applies to impacts of climate change, and we'll really invite them to reflect on the question of on the phrase "personal is political," and talk about how this adage applies to them and their work. And then we'll also talk about what barriers we must overcome in order for the movement for climate justice to advance and succeed. And then we'll ask them to talk about some of the key principles and practices that they've experienced in meaningfully centering race, class, and gender in the climate justice movement. And then in closing, they'll just talk about kind of one thing everyone in the room can do, either individually or as a part of an organization or otherwise, to make a difference in the movement towards climate justice. So that's kind of our overall thing. And my document has finally come up. So first of all, we'll just invite you all to introduce yourselves. So just we'll have a sense of who all is in the room, if that sounds okay. Do you want to start?
I'm Jennifer. I'm a lawyer.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Jennifer, Catherine Skopic, and I'm in the environmental movement. I've been associated with a couple of religious groups of people since John the Time, from Waterwatch to 50.org. IMAC,
Yes.
which is how I know Interfaith Moral Action on Climate, trying to get the churches, synagogues, all the religious groups working on this problem.
Thank you.
I'm Boogie. I'm a media activist, social media activist. We work with media teams from around the world, Syria, Ukraine, Russia, and we're getting ready to include indigenous people from indigenous tribes from South America and bring together in international calls, bring activists together.
Thank you.
My name is Cole. I'm a journalist for the Times magazine. I cover environmental issues.
Hi, I'm Antoinette, and I'm from Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where UPROSE is located.
Yeampierre from Brooklyn for Peace.
Thank you.
I'm Justin with Socialist Alternative and 15
Hi, I'm Sandy, and I live in Tina as well.
I'm Lucy. I've done a lot of work around student debt at NYU, also a little bit of prison justice and the Justice for Cecily campaign. And then I also grew up on the border between West Virginia and Virginia, so I've done a lot of mountaintop removal stuff my life.
Great.
I'm really having trouble talking right now.
Uh-oh.
I'm a nurse from Boston. I've been working on the best I can.
Thank you.
I'm David. I'm from One Struggle in Miami.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
So if you either want to just start off, introduce yourself and the work that you do, give us just an overview.
So the first question is why we came to this work.
Yes.
So I am a Puerto Rican of African and indigenous ancestry who was born and raised in New York City. I was displaced as a child, went to 5 schools in 8 years, lost my father at the age of 50 to an asthma attack, had an extreme bilateral pulmonary embolism 2 years ago, and I don't smoke. I came to this work because I think that there's nothing more fundamental than the right to breathe, that if you can't breathe, you can't fight for justice, and because it is people of color in New York City that are the reluctant hosts to all of the environmental burdens that exist in New York City. And by training, I'm a civil rights lawyer. My mom says I came out of the womb with the fist first. And because the environmental justice movement spoke to me, because it was about us speaking for ourselves. It said to me in a very personal way that we were not going to be the passive recipients of somebody else's good intentions, that we drove the agenda for our communities. And given what I know about climate change, it made sense to me that the groundswell and the community building, the leadership has to come from the ground. So I came to the work not having ever taken a class in environmental policy, not knowing the first thing about climate change. People came to our organization, which is Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization and is now an intergenerational, multiracial, multinational organization that really encompasses leadership that looks like the community. And they came and they said, they're going to expand the Gowanus Expressway. And what do we do about that? And there's a legislation on lead belt, on lead paint. What do we do about that? And so young people had come into our organization and they wanted to know how they could get involved, and we trained them to organize. And so we sort of grew organically and started from a place of not knowing anything about the environment to becoming a nationally recognized organization that has helped pass 3 pieces of legislation, helped double the amount of open space in Sunset Park, stopped the siting of a power plant the size of 3 football fields, expanded a median to make the community environmentally friendly, developed a framework so that communities and organizations in our community work to complement with each other's work instead of competing with each other, which is the way that people have been conditioned to be. And we've done some pretty cool stuff. So I'll talk more about that later. But
Thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Lilian Molina, and I was born in Honduras. I identify as a mestiza with Palestinian ancestry as well. I was raised in Chicago in an environmental justice community, and I had no idea what the term environmental justice or environmental racism meant until about 15 years ago. I grew up traveling with my mother to the suburbs, and I used to think we were going on a field trip because I knew that at the end of our train ride, I was going to be able to eat snacks that I didn't have at home, and I was going to be able to play with certain toys that I would not be able to in my household, where my mom would never buy me. So it was exciting. This train, it was like about an hour-long train ride to the suburbs. Then one day, my mom handed me a roll of paper towels and a bottle of Windex. And at that moment, I realized we weren't there to play, we're there to clean these folks' homes. And so every train ride after that became really cumbersome. And I would wonder on my train ride why it was that certain folks in my community were harassed by the police, specifically young people. And at the end of my train ride, young people can congregate without any problem. I wondered why the people at the end of the train ride wore suits to work, but the folks in my community, I just rarely ever saw anybody dressed up to go to work. And so all of these questions of why these differences, even the parks, right? Like the parks in my community, the very few parks, the swings were all dilapidated. There was always graffiti, written gang graffiti on the equipment. And the parks in the suburbs were like pristine and had like all this awesome looking equipment, you know? And there was always trees. And so questioning all these things and coming into like my teenage years was a challenge because no one really could give me the answers. I worked with people in my community to prevent them from joining gangs, because that was something that you did. It was like almost a rites of passage. You turn 11, 12, 13, and it was like you were automatically, you already knew what side of the community you were on, and that was your path, right? And if it weren't for my mom sending me to Honduras one summer, I think I would have gone straight down that path. She really saved my life on so many different levels. But so I'm telling you all of this because I did work to prevent young people, friends of mine and family members from joining gangs. And I know that New York doesn't have that problem. Chicago is unfortunately divided. And there's two main nations. There's a people nation and then there's a folk nation. And so there's all these little, I guess you could say, tribes that belong to this. And growing up, you know what side of the community you're on. You know what colors you can wear and what colors you can't wear. But I knew that we didn't have to live like that, because if people at the end of my train ride didn't have to worry about crossing these invisible borders, then why should the people in my community? So we worked, to set up different programs for young people because we thought maybe they don't have enough options. Setting up after-school programs, enrichment programs for them, giving them different opportunities. And that worked well, but the gang violence still continued. And I was asked to work at this high school, the Little Village Lawndale High School, that was a result of a community fight. There was 11 community mothers that went on a 17-day hunger strike to open up this high school because there was only one high school in the community, and young people had to travel across these gang boundaries to get to high school, and a lot of times there was violence before first period, shootings, beatings. And so this high school was open, and I thought to myself, what would it look like for us to have a garden here? I thought, you know, that summer that my mom sent me to Honduras, I really felt connected because my abuela is an herbalist, or was an herbalist, and a curandera healer, and she showed me all these herbs, and that really, like, that was one of the moments that changed my life. And so I was really geeked and excited to start this garden. And my friend was like, wait, we can't start planting. And I was like, what do you mean, why not? She's like, because the soil is contaminated. I was like, wait, hold up. What do you mean the soil is contaminated? And then she pointed to all of the different industries in the community that I saw every single day, but I had never made the connections between them. And so I started to do some research about what exactly was coming out of these facilities, and there was things like lead and mercury, and then finding out that the effects of lead and mercury are kind of irreversible. They obviously are neurotoxins, and they affect your ability to de-escalate a situation. And so at that moment, I realized that not only had my community been suffering from injustices in the school systems, harassment because, you know, police harassment because they're young, brown, and black people, but that there was this invisible death sentence that we had put on us. And the environmental justice framework for me, like, brought everything together, because when I looked and read the principles, it was like, wow, you're talking about workers' rights, you're talking about Native sovereignty, women's reproductive rights, and these were all things that I was passionate about and had kind of like helped support in some ways, but had never been able to fully work on them because it didn't fit my priorities that were around intervening on gang violence and preventing gang violence in my community. So that's how I came into this work. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Can I add something before we go to the next question? One of the things that's important to us as environmental justice activists, because, you know, there's a lot of focus on climate, and when you focus on climate, you're focusing on carbon. And for our communities, it's co-pollutants. It's the fact that all of this infrastructure is killing our people and has been. And when people talk about the environment and they talk about the quality of the air, they say we all breathe the air, the same air. But what they fail to take into account is the story that Lily is sharing with you, that we are not just being exposed to toxic harm right now. We have been exposed to toxic harm generationally. From colonialism and slavery from the very beginning, when we had access to the worst food, the worst living conditions, and we were put in the places where all of the environmental burdens were. So generation after generation has been exposed to toxic harm, which makes us now, in the face of climate change, more susceptible to disease, more vulnerable in a lot of different ways, because our physical condition, our susceptibility to disease did not manifest yesterday. It didn't manifest when we were born and we lived right next to all the burdens that were put in our community. It's really the result of historical trauma, of what we call historical trauma. And that's the case regardless of class. If you are a person of color living in the United States, chances are that you're living next to industry, next to infrastructure, next to the most polluting sources in the entire United States. If you live in Black Hollywood, you're living next to those oil rigs. If you're living in Clinton Hill, although that's changing tremendously and can't say the neighborhood's black anymore, but if you're living there, and even if you go and you see where public housing is, you're going to see the stacks of the power plants spewing into people's windows. So regardless of class, if you're a person of color, anywhere in the entire United States, chances are you're living next to the environmental burdens. So I just wanted to add that because we discover it, and then all of a sudden we're measuring NOx, SOx, carbon monoxide, and then the climate folks are saying, well, we need to focus on carbon. And that's one of the reasons they killed. We did not support cap and trade, because we said cap and trade didn't address the issue of siting, and it didn't address the issue of co-pollutants that were killing our people. We can't do one without the other. We have to do them both.
Taking copious notes. So that's good. And speaking of notes, actually send around a sign-in sheet. If you do want the notes from this session, then I can send them to you. So, but anyway, I'll ask the next question and then I'll work on that process. So, next question. How does the intersectionality frame apply to the impacts of climate change?
I think she just framed that so beautifully because she did talk about the intersection. I'm having a bilingual. Bueno, mi gente, a veces me pasa. So it's very difficult for me to be in a workshop like this or in a forum like this and not talk about privilege. I often say, and I tweet, that privilege is the biggest obstacle to addressing climate change. And you could tweet that now too. Follow me, Yeampierre. And I say that because the one thing that freaks me out, even as we're getting ready for the People's Climate March in September, is how people are handling or managing their privilege. Even when we ask them to read the Jimenez Principles for Democratic Organizing, and we ask them to agree, and they agree, and I'm going to go through them really quickly, all right? Just going to go through it because at the end, if we all agree that we're going to work together to address climate change, if we don't change the way that we work with each other, if we don't change that, we won't be able to do this. That's how simple that is. And it manifests in a lot of ways. So those principles, I'll read quickly, are be inclusive. You would think that would be a no-brainer. Emphasize on bottom-up organizing. People speak for themselves. Work together for mutuality and solidarity. Build just relationships and make a commitment to self-transformation. So we have these meetings and we discuss all these things and we talk about the role of privilege. And then, of course, the same person picks up the hand and sucks out all the oxygen out of the room without thinking that maybe they are doing that too much and that there are some people who have different levels of education who come to the table with different experiences and not giving them the space to communicate. One of the things that we've learned as we started doing the work around community, climate adaptation and resilience at our organization is that it isn't always the people with the highest level of education or with the most educational resources that have the answers. That people like us who come from struggle have always had to live sustainably because because poor people know how to repurpose, reuse, and recycle. Because people who come from struggle have had to live within their carbon footprint and have had to do the most with the least, right? So there are stories, there are experiences that come from being who we are, from wherever we come from, that can really redefine what being an American is. Because to people who are coming from other countries, being an American means to be wasteful. It means being addicted to consumption culture. And it means that if you're going to be successful, then you should be wasteful too. You should have 1 million pairs of shoes because that's what it means to be successful in this country, right? And to tell people who've never had anything before that they can't is the epitome of arrogance. They want it, it narcotizes them, it makes them feel good because struggle is something that unless you've experienced it on an everyday level, you don't understand. So we can't judge it. So finding the ways that we work together, I'm sorry. Oh, somebody just tweeted. All right. It's cool. Anyway, so even before, and I know, Lily's been doing this work for a real long time. We all know each other. One of the things that I was thinking about when I came here today was how people want to pick leaders in our community. And how annoying I find that and distressing that they have to pick leaders. And it reminded me, if you can indulge me for a second, of the story when I was in law school. This professor told me that the con law professor was freaking out. He was freaking out because there was no diversity in his classroom. There were no people of color. And so my African American professor says, yeah, there is. There's one. And he was like, one was enough. And so we go to meetings where one is enough because one can be managed. So people want to anoint us to be the person who speaks for everyone. They seduce us. They come to us, and there's always going to be the weak link in the movement. That person who, nobody ever made them feel that good before, right? And so, but they are comfortable with being in a meeting where there are 18 white folks and 1 or 2 people of color, and that's okay. And if there's two, that becomes a problem. I know because I come from meetings where there are two of us. And so, and I was telling Jackie when I came in that I feel so elbowed that my ribs are hurting. It's like, muévete. And I'm like, no, I'm not going anywhere. So, so if you walk into a space and it doesn't look like a neighborhood in New York City, and you're making all the decisions, you're in the wrong room, you're defining the space improperly, and you need to check your privilege. So I have to say that because even people with good intentions are having such a difficult time being able to deal with it. I have a few of the, that privilege is the biggest obstacle to addressing climate change. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I might have another one, but I want Livy to talk.
So as I mentioned, if you would have talked to me about environmentalism when I was younger, I would have laughed in your face. I don't know any polar bears. Whales are cool, but like the people in my neighborhood, specifically the young people, that was my main priority. But then once I saw the environmental justice framework, it all made sense. And I encourage you all to check out the environmental justice principles. They're part of the founding principles that serve as a moral compass for our movement. And I want to give you all just one quick story. On Friday, my friend Mark Lopez called me from East LA, and they're working on a big, huge portfolio of environmental justice issues there in the City of Commerce. And they had an offer from this company to put one of their co-directors on a decision-making board with a possibility of getting some funds. And so he called me because he said, I know that you all in your community were fighting Edison International. They had two of the oldest coal-fired power plants in our community. And he's like, and I want to make sure that there's nobody actively working against this company before we go ahead and pursue this. And that to me was like why I love the environmental justice movement. We really pride ourselves on making sure that whatever victory we're aiming for in our community is not going to become a burden on another community. We're adamantly opposed to shifting burden. And it keeps us together. It keeps our movement, regardless if we are the least funded movement. And as Elizabeth mentioned, they try to silo us and try to silo individuals and try to make it about a brown or black unicorn in the room. And I'm very uncomfortable being the only person of color in a space. When I moved from Chicago to DC in 2009 to take on the environmental justice director position at Energy Action Coalition. And I was like, you know what, this is gonna be okay. I have a couple of white friends, I know white people, it's not gonna be that bad. I get there and it was like the biggest culture shock of my life. Because these weren't like the white folks that I was used to, that were from working class families, that went to the same Chicago public schools as I did. These were kids that were sons and daughters of oil executives working around climate change, which is awesome, yes. You got access to some of the most powerful people, but don't do it to rebel against your parents. Use that access to power to really move our movement forward. Sons and daughters of like former senators, and these kids would talk about their summer vacations and all this stuff, and I was like completely disconnected from that. If it weren't for my community supporting me, I would call home like in tears because I felt inadequate. I felt like I didn't go to the schools that these kids went to. Like, I went to junior college and then I went to a commuter school, and my background is in bilingual bicultural education. And that was the first time that I had to work with people of such privilege. But I knew, as Elizabeth mentioned, their intentions were good, and they would treat me to lunch, and sometimes after work we'd go to happy hour and they'd pay for my wine and whatever I would drink. But when it came to decision-making power, that was non-negotiable. And I got into a lot of heated debates with them in spaces, and I refused, to be the only person of color in the space. And any moment that I was able to bring more people into the room, I did. But it's a threatening act, and we should not settle for just that one person of color in the room, because we don't ever settle for just one white man in leadership, right? We don't ever just settle for one white person and say, well, check, box is checked. We did it, our commitment to diversity. But I'm going kind of off the topic, but going back to the intersectionality frame and how it applies to the impacts of climate change. There's this great docu-series called Living in Dangerous Times on Showtime.
Years of Living Dangerously.
Years of Living Dangerously.
Maybe
Thank you.
that's a different one.
Thank you. And I watched the first episode, and there's a reporter from the New York Times that has been focusing on the conflicts in the Middle East. And so his latest work has been around the conflicts in Syria. He went out to Syria and he interviewed people, and he realized that in the 4 years leading to the social unrest in Syria, that there was a huge drought that caused people from the countryside, farmers, to move to the big cities. And that resulted in 10 people living in a room maybe smaller than this, substandard living conditions, right? And so that, coupled with just the lack of government accountability and the lack of resources that people were getting, turned into what we see now, this conflict in Syria. And that's not the only case. Remember Darfur years ago? That is a conflict that also started because two tribal groups shared a watering hole for the herds that they worked with. That started to dry up, and obviously conflict arose. So the intersectionalities of the impacts of climate change are really deep. I see it in my community. The first warm days in Chicago, you see an upsurge in gang violence. So the longer, and I love summertime, especially in Chicago, so much fun stuff to do. But I started to see the links between the longer summer, the bigger heat waves, and what that causes. So there are many different things, from the extraction of these dangerous fossil fuels and extreme energy in communities, indigenous communities that have been fighting for sovereignty, for the last 500 years, fighting against imperialism, fighting to get more resources in their communities, having to face drought, having to face shortages of water. So there's many different ways that all of these issues come to head. And I think that Hurricane Katrina is one of the most vivid examples that we have in recent history, where you have people that were already economically oppressed, having to evacuate their homes. And we see how white supremacy played a role in who was able to escape, right? Who had the resources to actually get into a vehicle and leave. And I don't know if you all saw that image of black folks trying to cross a bridge, and there was sheriffs at the bridge preventing people. And so when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about an overall ending to violence against our communities, wars against our communities, because all of these historical systemic issues that our communities face only get exacerbated by climate change. And you can also see that in how Hurricane Sandy affected people here as well. Yeah.
There is it's one of the things is that our frame comes out of the environmental justice movement, and so when we think about I can't say that word, but we think about where we work, play, live, learn, environment for us is everything. And one of the things that we're seeing happening now, which is really, really sad, is that our environmental successes are being used by developers to promote the displacement of our community. So the minute that we get a greenway or we get a waterfront park, developers are using our successes. The successes that we've gotten, by the way, through being underfunded, working extremely hard, because if an institution is headed by a person of color, chances are you're going to get less funding than if it's a white executive director, and there are studies on that. I'm not making that up. Because people like missionaries, and they like green missionaries, and our community sometimes, in the effort to try to green things up, doesn't really think about the political frame. You know, people start urban gardens where the people who run the institutions and make the decisions are people who moved into those communities because the rent was cheap, but the kids picking the plants are black children. And though that kind of power dynamic is unacceptable to us. And I think that if you raise it with the folks that are doing this, they're like, wait, but this wasn't here, we're bringing something. But what you're not doing is shifting power. Our organization is intergenerational. What that means is that young people are on our board of directors, they're on our staff, they're an integral part of decision making. We don't have a youth program where we sit around and say, ooh, what do the young people think? We believe that leadership is a continuum, and that you exercise leadership throughout that continuum, and that people come with different levels of training, and so you level the playing field by providing that, but that young people don't have to wait to exercise leadership. They just need to be provided with the tools, just like our community. But the idea of creating this youth program minoritizes them, puts them in a silo, and they are not an integral part. It's patronizing, right? Well, same thing with race. The same thing with race, when you basically have people coming into our communities because they have this dream and this vision and they've been wanting to do this, and our communities are so cool and so raw, and they basically set up shop and do things that we have been doing for a minute, without exploring who's doing what, how do we work so that we work to complement what they're doing and support it, instead of sort of parachuting in and telling us what's in the best interest of our community. And so you see places like New Orleans, where now there's massive gentrification, and there are tensions between new immigrants and black people. And I'm going to use black people because I never thought there was anything wrong with black. And coming from African ancestors, both of us who get that, we get that. So and then you've got, folks that are coming in, smart, coming in, taking these jobs that are low wages and then organizing so that they can get better wages, but pitting themselves against the people who've been there for a minute, creating tensions where people really should be working together. In New York City, you're seeing, you see the unions, right? And you see the unions, they don't want to say things like extraction, coal, divestment, fracking. They don't want to say those things, but our people need to work somewhere. And so we need to figure out how we build those bridges and how we engage in a conversation that introduces our people to the next economy, to figuring out how we're going to live with what we need instead of what we want. And how do you do that with people who have been struggling for so long and never had anything? It is really complicated. But how we do it together, I think, really, really matters. So for me, I'm going to try again with the intersectionality. Yay, got it. I got it out. All of it is connected. All of it is connected. What we tell, for example, the large groups that get all the funding, I mean, you got to check that out. The Environmental Defense, NRDC, all of them, they get all the bucks, right? We understand that they have access to resources and technical expertise that is absolutely necessary for our community. And in every one of those organizations, there's always that one person or two people who went there because they want to do good. And when they work with us in a way that is principled and respectful, we're able to do some really powerful transformational things. Lilian said something that really, I wanted to tweet her, but I couldn't find her handle. She said, we are adamantly opposed to shifting the burden. What that means is that as a movement, we share resources, we share expertise, we take each other's backs. If something is happening, if there's a facility coming to Sunset Park, and we say, no, you can't put it in Sunset Park, we're not going to say, yeah, you can put it in Hunts Point. You can't put it in Newark. You can't put it in Jersey City. So we support each other in that way, and that I think it extends to all of the other isms that our communities are dealing with. Our young people come to our organization while they have been racially profiled and stopped by the police on the way to come and do some community work. So we can't separate those things, and we don't. And but how we approach them, and how you take your good spirit, your will, your intentions, and transform it into something that is going to create a different kind of rhythm, so that we can approach climate change together. I think that's the challenge.
So, in some ways, I mean, both of you have addressed this next question about how the personal is political adage applies to you, but if you'd like to elaborate on it, otherwise, I feel like you've covered that. We can move.
Yeah, it is really difficult when you come from struggle not to think that this isn't personal. Right. We're born, raised, and grow up in these communities. We work in these communities. We were, for some of us who are a little bit older, the children of the civil rights movement who had the opportunity to go to school and came back with our degrees. Somebody said to me the other day, "Oh, you're a lawyer." I said, "I'm a lawyer and I'm street." It's a bad combination, you know. I know, I'm one generation away from poverty. I know my father spent his life in and out of prison, and he was a junkie. That's where I come from. I come from struggle. And so my law degree was really an opportunity. And what I learned when I was a kid was that over 50% of the Congress had a law degree, and less than 1% of my community had one. And that everything we did, whether it was air, how this pocketbook was made, or this orange, was regulated. It was sort of thinking about power is how I went into it. Went into law school, hated it, hated lawyers, had no rhythm for them. But it has been it was a tremendous opportunity to take what I learned, break it down, and make it accessible to people on the ground. That has been the joy of being a lawyer for me. But it is personal. It is personal when all of my family who stayed in the South Bronx when it was burning developed lupus, upper respiratory disease, and asthma. It is personal when you have health problems, lots of them when you eat well, when you're healthy, when you've never done anything to compromise your system. It is all personal when you see that you have people on the board of directors who get up in the middle of the night to see if their children are still breathing. So it is not some intellectual exercise that we went to school to study so that we can then help people that can't help themselves. It is all personal. And now with climate change and with Sandy, 2007, 2008, UPROSE was testifying. One of our young people who just came back from Antarctica, from the South Pole, who got the Brower Award representing North America, testified in front of EPA that there was a 90% chance of a storm surge in New York City. And no one was listening. And we knew that our communities would be hardest hit. And so we are working with scientists, with engineers, with planners, with GIS, with mappers, with all kinds of people. It is really different. It is not the 70s anymore. We have access to those kinds of resources in our communities. And so working with us doesn't have to be a challenge. It could be a real party. It could be an emotional, intellectual, spiritual, lifting opportunity of transformation. But it is indeed personal.
Yes, it is very personal. As I mentioned, for me, it was finding the links between mercury and lead and some of the violent outbreaks in my community. I came across data showing that about 50% of the prison inmates in Texas had elevated levels of lead. And that was just one study. There's been numerous studies linking that. And knowing that, not only are the schools in my community under-resourced, knowing that the libraries in my community, have outdated books, knowing that all of the resources that would help my community members improve their lives and the lives of their families have always been scarce. And then also realizing that my community was targeted by environmental racism. Realizing that it wasn't just my community that was targeted by environmental racism, that there are Black communities across the country, that there are indigenous communities across this country that have been targeted. And when I say targeted, I mean targeted. It's not, oops, we put a plant here, we didn't know what the demographic makeup was. No, it was intentional. They put it there because of that, because of the sole reason that they think we don't have the power. And it's also personal for me to think about the reasons why some of my family members migrate to this country. A lot of the folks that are migrating come from the fields. You know, they're the ones that are growing the food for us. And they are exposed, you know, to pesticides, but they're also forced to leave their lands to come up north because of droughts, or because of things like NAFTA, you know, where the U.S. has set parameters on how much people can produce in Mexico and now with CAFTA in Central America. And so it's personal on so many levels. And I think I'm going to tie this back to the previous question. One of the biggest challenges that I faced in working with my white colleagues was that they look at everything myopically. And everything is about just climate change. And we don't have that luxury coming from our communities. We have to see things through a kaleidoscope. We have to see how all of these things relate. And supporting immigration rights is also part of the climate challenge. Supporting to end the school to prison pipeline is also directly linked to environmental justice and climate justice. You know, there's so many linkages, and we see that because we live those lives every single day. So the personal is political because, as Elizabeth mentioned, you know, for us, we come from these lives. It's not something we read in a sociology textbook. It's what we experience on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Are you interested in sharing your Twitter handle?
Oh, sure. It's okay. It's EJ Chola, CHEJCHOLA 1. It's a nickname that I have.
So I was looking for Chola and I forgot the EJ part.
And for those who don't already have Elizabeth's, because I know some of you already found it, but do you want to share yours, Elizabeth, just to make sure?
Yeampierre.
Just
Yeampierre. YEAMPIERRE.
I'm not on Twitter much. I need to read more.
Awesome. Thank you.
I got the mayor's office really pissed once twittering, and I got them to change something really important. It was after Sandy, and they held a meeting to discuss the impacts of Sandy in the most privileged community and excluded Sunset Park and Red Hook. And I was twittering, and they went nuts. And at that moment, I realized that it was a really good organizing tool, and that's why I started using it. So yeah, and they ended up coming to Sunset Park.
That's fantastic. That's good. Okay, so got wrapped up. So, and again, we've already talked about some of these already, but if you have anything to add, what barriers must we overcome in order for the movement to advance climate justice to succeed?
Well, I think, you know, I think Lily just beautifully framed it, what she was talking about, how things are intersected, and how our movements need to be working with each other. I think there's a lot of navel gazing, a lot of talking about things and not a lot of doing. You know, I think that people are very tunnel vision, and that their issue is the only issue, and that's fine. But I've been in meetings where we've been trying to figure out, how do we roll out this People's Climate March? How do we have this big net which brings everybody in and everybody's struggle? And we hear people saying, well, we need to talk about fracking and fracking and fracking and fracking. We're like, okay, we got you. Fracking is going to be there. There's no stopping it. It's important. And I'll say, well, you know, we want to make sure that as people are coming from all over the country and all over the world, that the local narrative doesn't disappear, that the struggle of people in Red Hook, in Lower East Side, Sunset Park, in Barrio, the South Bronx, that there's a way that we could bring up the struggle of our people, because when they leave, we will still be here. And we want to make sure that there's a community building process that takes place between now and the march, so that it isn't just the march. The march is just the one day. But what we want to do is build climate consciousness from now until the march. And we want to use different kinds of ways of community building. We can take advantage of a lot of the stuff that's happening in the summer in New York City, but we need to do that. And it may be different for each community, and you have to respect that. And it's like fracking. And we're like, when you do that, it turns us off. It turns us off, and then we're like, we got no rhythm for fracking. We don't even want to talk about it. Like, what? You don't want to talk about fracking? And of course we do. And of course we support it. But it is in New York State a well-resourced, celebrity-supported campaign. Whereas our campaigns, and we have to deal with when people have the privilege of working on one issue, we have to work on energy, on brownfields, on solid waste, on air quality, on lead. Our organizations have to become experts and work on every single environmental burden that affects the quality of life and the public health disparities in our community. We don't have the luxury to just work on the one issue. So if we say something like we support it, we're in solidarity with you, it's all good, let it go. And it's that issue of privilege where people can't let it go. That sense of entitlement where it's about me 24/7, I have the most important thing, and I am not going to respect the fact that you just said, I got your back, and you got 50 issues to work on. That privilege is so freaking divisive. And I'm sorry to pick on the frackers, they're not the only ones, okay? They're not the only ones. But I used it as an example of how people can really turn people off to their issue and can divide, when we really need to figure out how we allocate resources differently and work with each other differently, and use this opportunity, at least because I'm going to keep saying the People's Climate March a bunch of times, to do community building from now until then. I just want to throw some ideas out there of things that you can do, because I'm all about putting things on the ground and not just talking about them. You could create people's climate tents in every neighborhood. You could create art, puppetry, where people come in telling the story of their community. So that, for example, if Hunts Point comes in, they have the highest asthma rate in the world. It could be a giant asthma pump, right? Some people said things like the scientists would be coming in wearing lab coats, the beekeepers would be wearing bee suits. It has to be highly visible, really powerful, so that the world is paying attention, and so that we say, this is the people's response. I mean, the thing about this march that's different is that we want to say, that's what we called it, the People's Climate March. We're even telling celebrities and people who think that they're dignitaries that they have to march with the people. They can't march in the front, they got to be with the people. We've asked that the front line be made up of young people, even though we're intergenerational. We've asked that they be made up of the front because that's the generation that's going to be most impacted by this. And we want them in the front. And they've said yes. So, I feel a really strong sense of urgency. I'm really freaking out. My family lives in Miami. I'm Puerto Rican. I don't think of polar bears. I think of coral reefs. I'm an island person. I love the city. I meet with scientists from all over the country. I sit on a lot of advisory councils. And I can tell you that people from all walks of life are freaking out about what's coming. And that there's no chance, and there's just no time for us to sort of let our egos get in the way of working with each other differently. There's just no time. Time is up. Time is up. And so, I mean, that's all I have to say. I don't want to end on a negative note. I think that this, so I'm going to say this. I think this is a test for our ability to do that. This is a challenge for our ability to create a different kind of community with each other.
Elizabeth, you just started rattling off a list of issues other than fracking. Just at some point,
Okay, because I realize when I go so long,
No, it's okay.
take up space.
Brownfields.
Oh, I said brownfields, open space, energy, lead, just a lot of different issues that we work on. It's a lot. Co-pollutants, NOx, SOx, carbon monoxide. We've got state-of-the-art technology where we measure PM 2.5 and all of those emissions in Sunset Park. Transportation, we do a lot of work around transportation justice. The lack of access to mass transit in communities that, people don't go into the CBD anymore. They go from Brooklyn to Queens and back. And there are communities like Canarsie that don't have access to buses. We know that climate change is going to change transportation because the subway is no longer going to be an option. So mass transit is a big issue for our organization, and we've been involved in local, citywide, statewide, and national campaigns. And it's a little organization, and we wonder how we do all that, but we do. And it's stressful, and it affects our health because we work 24/7. So anyway, it's a lot of issues, and if you go to the website, you'll see some of them.
No, it's okay. So some of the barriers I already talked about, just the myopic view of the mainstream environmental movement, and this is not something new. This is something that is historical. There's been historical tensions between environmentalists, people of color, and indigenous people. And that's another, I'll leave that for later.
Workshop.
Yeah. But, the environmental movement was started by mainly white males, and there's a lot of scholars that study, why was it white males? Well, women were involved in women's suffrage at the time. There was other issues that white women were facing, and so white men wanted to preserve their hunting lands. It started more about preserving and conserving these natural spaces. And this was like in the late 1800s when the Sierra Club started. And there was a time period where the Sierra Club would not allow people of color, specifically black people, to join even as paying members. So the racism is one of the biggest barriers, I think, in this, because unfortunately our movements, as much as we try to create a new paradigm, we don't focus on the self-transformation piece enough. And it's like, one of the godfathers of the left, Paulo Freire, he says in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, like, if we're serious about shifting the paradigm, oppressed people have to formulate their own ideologies, because what wound up happening is we wound up adopting the ideologies of our oppressor. And so we all suffer from oppression. We all suffer from white supremacy, even if you have been on the beneficiary side of it. There's some deep mental health issues that come along with living in a white supremacist society for all members involved. And so, we tried to work with the environmental movement and in the past, and we were often left at the altar, because when it came to focusing on issues such as the lead abatement in inner city housing, the environmentalists were like, what does that have to do with the environment? And it's like, this is what our communities, again, going back to that intersectional lifestyle that we live, that's what they're facing, I often talk about how the Koch brothers, they don't focus on one single issue. These mugs are thinking of kaleidoscope, right? Multi-issues. They're like, how are we going to... Sorry, I had to get a little hood. I try not to be.
That's always good. That's always good.
But, they're talking about immigration. They're talking about gun control. They're talking about, completely taking civil rights out and Chicano studies out of history. They're not just focusing on the environment. They're trying to roll back EPA regulations and power, and they're trying to advance their agenda, but they're seeing it from a 360-degree view. And I think that that's one of the most crippling things for the progressive movement or left movement as a whole, is that we focus on just one issue, and it has to do, I think, with the resources and how foundations kind of put you in that in a box. As I mentioned, racism and classism are also some of the huge burdens, and I really encourage white people to do that transformative work. Look for support networks. There are, there's in training institutions that focus on anti-racism and anti-oppression, and I think that that's really important work to do as we work to decolonize our minds, because as I mentioned earlier, people of color and indigenous folks, we don't all get along, and that's hard for me, and that's something I've started to share a little bit more openly, because I was taught you leave the dirty laundry in the house, you don't ever share the family affairs. But I think, as Elizabeth mentioned, we have to work together in ways that we've never worked in before, and that involves honesty and transparency. I also wanted to talk about the movement ADD syndrome that we have. It's like whatever the new hot thing is, that's what all of the environmental movement is going to focus on. As Elizabeth mentioned, fracking is a big thing now. Fracking's been a big issue in Indian country. And our folks in North Dakota have been fighting against fracking in the industry for at least a decade. When we were fighting to shutter the coal plants in Chicago, the Sierra Club approached us in 2007 to partner with us. And they asked us what our campaign goal was, and we said we want to completely shut these coal plants down. And they said, why don't you ask to transition to natural gas? That's more politically realistic. And we said, F off. You know why? Because we know people that are in North Dakota fighting against fracking. We knew, because our network, we live at the source of these issues. And so that's another suggestion, another barrier is the Columbus syndrome, where people think that they've discovered the new issue. If you would be listening to the canaries in the mine, we wouldn't have to wait till James Hansen comes out with, the tar sands, if the KXL pipeline gets built, then it's game over for the climate. What about the indigenous people that have been living at ground zero for the past 20 years of the tar sands extraction? They've been there, but no one wanted to listen because it's too much. It's like, wait, we have to fight against imperialism, and we have to fight to I don't want to say protect the sovereignty, because Indigenous and First Nations people don't even have the sovereignty, but to uphold these treaties. I've had so many of my colleagues be like, that's unrealistic, that's just way too much. It's like, if we're really going to get to the root of these issues, we have to roll up our sleeves. And this is for the long haul. We're training for a marathon, and that's what in our communities, in the EJ and CJ movement, we know this. We've been working, we can't just jump from one issue to the other. We don't have, again, that's a luxury. We can't say, okay, you know what, fracking is a new thing, I'm gonna forget about all these other issues in my community. No, they're still there. And do you think we wanna be working on a campaign for a decade? No, we don't want to be working on a campaign for a decade. We often have people come in, they're like, well, have you tried this avenue and this? Yes, we have tried that all. But because of institutional racism and classism, there are barriers for us being able to get to those victories. And so with the Keystone XL pipeline, Bill McKibben, I think he's like one of the quintessential Columbus syndrome sufferers in my mind, because and he just discovered environmental justice. It's like, open up your minds. Don't think that because this is the first time you're hearing about something that it's a new thing. Yes.
You were in a row.
No.
But I do want to say something that's really, and I don't want to forget it. So here's how everything is changing. By 2042, we're the majority in the country. And so we are not fighting to be at anybody's table anymore. We're just building our own. And you could come to ours if you come correct, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm just saying that. Just 2 weeks ago, a Yupik woman told me that they were only able to hunt 300 walruses, where in the past they were able to hunt 1,000, and that her village was going hungry in Alaska. So these are the people that Lily is talking about. These are part of our community. This is our community across the country. So the majority of the country is going to look like us. And it's going to look like us at a time when climate change has basically having its way with us and the economy is going to be tanking. And if our communities on a grassroots level are not engaged in a way that's meaningful to lead this charge, we are in so much trouble. So it is so important that the power dynamics change, because our communities need to feel as strongly about climate change as they did about the civil rights movement back in the day. And as long as they think other people are taking care of them and that they're managing it and that they're the passive recipients of somebody, think about what happens to our communities. The organizations that exist in our communities that are really well funded are usually social service organizations. So our communities come in like lemmings to get their problems solved for them. Our organizations are not, it's not a social service, it's a social justice organization. It's about creating community power, about people driving their own agenda, about people setting their own goals, and leadership looking like them so that they can see themselves in these positions. That, given what we know about climate change and given what we know about the change in the population, is so freaking important. I can't even begin to tell you. Do you want to lead a group of people and then have those people depend on you because that's what your ego needs? Or do you want to facilitate the building of meaningful community engagement that really transforms the landscape and transforms power relationships? That's what I think we need to do, because it's here. It's having its way with us. You know, the West Coast is burning. Gasland, we saw Gasland. We were trying to be supportive. They brought it to UPROSE. And you know what I saw? I saw a film that was made in Indian country in the Southwest, and I didn't see one Mexican, I didn't see one indigenous person, and the people in the audience looked at it and said, what? It was a missed opportunity to build relationships, to create solidarity, to tell the whole story. It was a missed opportunity, and we don't have any time to miss any more of them. Yeah, sorry. I get upset. I'm sorry. It's just that I just think that some of this is just common sense. You know, let's do this together and let's do it right, you know?
So I do want to open, because I think with our last question we were talking about principles, and both you referred to the EJ principles and the Hermes principles, so maybe we can just open it up to the group in terms of a discussion, questions or comments that you'd like to bring to the panelists. Yes.
Sort of one thing that I noticed in like what you all were talking about with issues in their communities is in some ways it parallels a lot of the issues in like that poor white people face in like rural Appalachia with hydrofracking and mountaintop removal, and that it is like the like literal destruction of your like land and your community, and also the literal destruction of your bodies via like pollution. And I was wondering, I know rural Appalachia, I know from personal experience, rural Appalachia is not always the nicest place in terms of racial justice. But I was wondering if there's any sort of history of trying to like bridge the similarities in those two issues and like work together, and like if it's working now, if it didn't work out, or like what needs to be done on that front, because I think that could be like a powerful alliance.
So we do work with folks from Appalachia, and we've even, I served as the chair of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and I recommended that someone from there be appointed because I thought that was important. My experience has been, though, good and bad. Definitely there are a lot of things in common. But then when race comes into question, the people from Appalachia become the fracking people in the room. So we could have a gathering of folks, and we are listening to everyone. We're listening, you know, to the folks from Indian country, we're listening to folks from West Coast, everybody. But then the people from that part of the world just take up all of the oxygen. You know, and they become fracking people, and so they discard. So it becomes a very uncomfortable thing because the privilege is just out of control. But do we think that it is a tremendously important issue, and do we see the connections between mountaintop removal and our struggle? Absolutely. I mean, we shared with our young people just pictures of mountains that had had been destroyed, because it's just on a visceral level so painful to see, even if you don't know the human story, just to see what they've done to the mountain. We totally connect with that struggle.
I did not know that poor white people existed, honestly, until I was older. Because I mean, there was always the like little jokes about hillbillies and like poor white trash, but the white people that I interfaced with were either really wealthy or working class. So like poor white people I didn't know about till I was older. And I actually met some of the folks like Judy Bonds and Larry Gibson, yes. At the 2007 U.S. Social Forum, and that was really transformative for myself and for the delegation that I was there with from the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, because we obviously automatically saw the connection. Here they are dealing with the source of coal, and here we are dealing with the combustion, right? Like from the cradle to the grave. And so from that experience, we actually did form an alliance, and we did these kind of cultural exchanges that we called From the Holler to the Hood. And we brought in folks from the hollers, which are like the valleys, to our hood. And they talked at the local high schools, and they, we took them around to get a toxic tour. And then we also went down, and I did a flyover of one of the MTR sites, and that was devastating. And for me, like, I did not personally face any sort of racial discrimination when I was in Appalachia, but I think it's because at times I can be white passing, as hard as that is for me to admit. I'm safe. I'm a safer looking person of color, right? I completely identify as a person of color, but if I think I would have been there with like one of my black homies, it would have been a completely different experience. And so to answer your question, we have been successful in forming alliances and at least sharing, the common narrative. But as Elizabeth mentioned, the issue of race does come up. And I still have great memories of going to Appalachia. And the young people from my community, when they met Judy Bonds, they were like, she's hood just like us. Oh my God, we can really connect. Because they had never been able to connect with white people. And so that was transformative for them. And I mean, that's worth $1 billion in my mind, because I was a youth worker in Chicago. Yes.
This is really inspiring and great. I'm doing my PhD in sociology, and I'm studying social class and climate change and how that intersects. So your statement about privilege is just very powerful, because for me, I always thought it was class. And privilege brings that other kind of punch to it. I think I wanted, I don't know if I want to make a corrective here or. So I like everything you said, but when you said one thing, you said class aside, if you look at environmental justice. And so since I study class, I'm like, whoa, you can't just take class. But I don't
I didn't take it out. I just said that if you just look at race.
Let me finish. But I think one of the things I also study is how class often gets misrecognized. And we say race, or like white people, and so I think a lot of times what we're really saying is sort of like middle class, like half of white people. So I think we just want to be careful with the intersectionality is definitely there, but how class is still, I think, a more prevalent issue with environmental issues. And I mean, they're intersecting. That's all.
They are, but we've had sociologists. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Robert Bullard, and they commissioned a study called Toxic Waste and Race. Toxic Waste and Race, and they looked at income levels of Black folks and the proximity for them living near a waste site. And race superseded class. So even when you do have middle income Black people, according to this study, they're still subjected to living within 1 to 3 miles of a toxic hazardous site.
One statistic to just to toxic waste and race.
You should just look at Bob Bullard's books.
Yeah.
He has a long
50 of them. Yeah. But the one statistic that stands out that really emphasizes that point is that an African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white family making $15,000 a year. So that was really, that's the one that often gets used to really emphasize that point.
And I think also one thing is that, and I feel safe-ish in this space, and I'm going to share this with you all. I think we really, in the United States, have to look at our anti-blackness, not just here in the U.S., but across the globe, right? Because we can play Oppression Olympics, you know, and I could say, well, I migrated here with my family. I had to learn English. You know, my mom worked, she's a domestic laborer. Like, I didn't go to a great college. But if Jackie and I walk into a room together, automatically I have more privilege. Maybe when we start talking credentials, that might be a little bit different. But race is a serious issue in this country, still to this day. And the New York Times actually had a great article recently about Latinos. And this is something that I've been talking about since the 2010 census, that they don't have, you know, because Latinos are not considered a race, right? So they don't have a little checkbox for us in that area. So then we're faced with white, negro, that was the actual term used in the 2010 census, indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, and because of our colonized minds in Latin America, unfortunately, like my mom talks about what she learned in Honduras was that the Spaniards came over and saved the indigenous people, that they were savages. Like, this is the history that she was taught, right? People are not going to check the indigenous box, unfortunately, right away. They sure as hell are not going to check the negro box. And so that puts us in the position to check white. And thinking about how the history of the Latin diaspora and what role, you know, Europeans played in that, it's going to be very easy for Latinos to assimilate within a couple of generations. For some of us that don't have like a lot of African ancestry recently, you know?
But there are some that are white. There are some
Yes.
Latinos that are white. I mean,
Exactly.
you know, my mom came here and she was here during the Black Power movement. And basically what she said to me is that you may be light-skinned, but our ancestors came through the Mid-Atlantic Passage. Some ended up in the Caribbean, and some ended up in Brazil, and some ended up in the United States, and we're all part of the same people. And the reason I say that, and that's why I introduce myself as someone of African and indigenous ancestry, I don't just say Puerto Rican, because honestly, you talk about the Argentinians, you talk about people from Spain. Hispanic or Latino is considered anybody with a Spanish surname, anybody who comes from Spain, and Spaniards certainly don't think that they're people of color. And so people think we're homogenous, and they lump us all in together when we're all so different from each other. My son, when he was in 6th grade, he graduated from college 2 years ago. He doesn't speak Spanish. I was trying to get him to learn how to speak Spanish because it was practical. And now that he's seriously dating, he wants to learn how to speak Spanish. But back when he was in 6th grade, he said, "Mom, Spanish is just the language of another slaver, another colonizer. You want me to speak both?" What does a mother say to that? I raised them on the left side of utero. I did the right thing. So I share that with you, and I'm sorry I interrupt. It's just that it's so complicated with us because you say Latino, and then just anybody is Latino, and you watch the novelas on TV, and basically they're these really uber white women with maids that look like our moms. You know what I mean? So and look, what have we learned, right? We have learned how to treat each other. How the corporations that we criticize treat us, right? So that whole power dynamic of being competitive, taking each other out, that kind of like the self-hate, we've internalized all that stuff. So you're absolutely right. This is an issue that we talk a lot when we do our leadership training. We ask everybody who their people are. who your people are matters. And then we connect all of those struggles. So if we have somebody from Egypt, we want to know. If you're from Palestine, we want to know. If you're from Mexico, we want to know. And then we connect those struggles, because when somebody says to me, I'm Latina, well, that doesn't, no, I'm very specific. I'm a Puerto Rican of indigenous and African ancestry. Because saying I'm Latina is like saying nothing. It's like I could be from Argentina, you know, so it's complicated, and then people just lump us together. And it pits people against each other. That's the sad part. One of the issues that Lily made me think about is this word diversity, and how diversity has been used. And basically, diversity has been used to gut affirmative action, to remove yourselves from the commitment of addressing people who have experienced racism here in this country for years. It has been used, affirmative action was supposed to level the playing field. And what's happened is that you've got these people coming from all over the world, with or without income, sometimes privilege, taking up the spaces that were originally created for those people who have historically been disadvantaged in this country. And so what you're seeing right now is that blacks and Puerto Ricans specifically in New York City are lagging behind every single racial and ethnic group, including new immigrants. That blows my mind, you know, because all of a sudden that door that they opened for everybody else, they got left holding the door. So while we think diversity is a powerful and strong and necessary thing, and we love that, we want to lift that, we celebrate difference, we also think we need to pay attention and target those people who've been left out and level the playing field. So in our organization, we have a lot of love for everybody. There's a little bit of everybody. It's like sancocho, right? But we try to target communities that are left out. So when it was our LGBTQ youth that were being attacked in that community, we did an initiative around them. When it was our Arab youth after September 11th, we did an initiative around them. Now it's our Puerto Rican youth. We have an initiative specifically to target our Puerto Rican youth.
No, it's
had a lot of
hard.
opinions.
No, it's hard for me to like talk about these issues, but I feel like I have to start talking about them with white people, so that you understand that there's a lot of nuances even within our communities, and that it's not going to be like this, we're galloping and skipping down this path towards climate justice. It's going to be hard, and we have to be willing to talk about these things and be honest. And this is part of my self-transformation, is being more open, you know, because before I'd be like, no, we don't got any problems. It's only white people that got the problems. You know, y'all deal with it over there. But that, I realized, is a short-sighted vision for me personally.
I guess when you say white people, I'm just wondering how much of that is a class?
There is some of it that is class, but
right.
Also white privilege exists. White
I'm not
supremacy
arguing any of
exists.
that.
You know, like
when we use the race word is actually, from what I've learned, is a better way to fight for justice in the United States. Class has become a taboo language. When we start talking class, and it gets sort of shut down as you're creating class warfare and you're a Marxist and all this kind of crap. You know what I mean?
But when you look historically at class divisions and where certain ethnic and racial groups fall within that, like, unfortunately, the majority of poor people are people of color because of white supremacy,
that's exactly
right?
what I'm saying. Yeah, we're saying the same thing.
So,
does anyone else have any questions or comments?
And I also want to just chime in and say that I have a hard stop at 1:30. I explained to some of the folks who weren't here before, but if you wanted to stay on, then I'll just kind of slip out and let you guys moderate yourselves from here. Is that okay?
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions,
Oh,
Jackie,
sure.
and putting us together.
No, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all. So,
How can I get the notes?
notes. Yes, let me give you my.
Oh, that list, we're gonna pass.
Yeah, the list didn't really happen.
I'll get it.
Okay,
I'll
great.
pass this around and then I'll send you a picture of it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and I'll give you my card.
You didn't get to tell us your story, Jackie.
It's true. I'll tell you in the notes.
Where do you live, Jeff?
I live in Maryland, actually. Yeah.
Just say a word about IMAC.
IMAC.
No, yes, no.
I think you could while I'm.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you don't mind. Yeah, it's all right. Thanks.
fun.
Yeah.
Were there any more questions?
Like, I had experience working at mainstream environmental organizations as well, and like trying to support environmental justice as well. I've been learning about the differences, and I've always struggled about like how to shift the balance of power, like intervene, like what to do with my identity and like my position. I'm just like thinking about like, since for like 30, 40 years, there's been this like challenging of mainstream groups to look at their diversity and become practical, like stop putting justice in isolation if they do anything. What's the ask at this point? Because some groups even feel like totally irrelevant to me, given the foundations of like how they came to be and like what they're working on now. So I'm just like thinking, like, what's the ask of these legacy groups? Like, how do we actually shift towards like equity and shift that like access to resources? Because I guess the pro foundations in there too, like needing to totally challenge them on their power and privilege and how they set each other and everything. So the question is like how to lift EJ like into more like a focus point, because it is so old and it is
One of the things that we've seen happen with a lot of the national mainstream environmental groups is that they've all decided that because the demographics are changing that they're going to do environmental justice. So what they've done is they've hired environmental justice organizers and coordinators to come into our neighborhoods and do what we're already doing. And so they've taken away resources from us, and they've created a situation that has created more tension. What we have historically done is we have reached out to those groups and said, this is what we need from you. We need this assistance. So for example, I served on Mayor Bloomberg's Sustainability Advisory Board. And on that board, they were trying to push waste to energy. And I felt that waste to energy wasn't going to be in the interest of our community, but I didn't know enough about it. So I contacted NRDC and I said, listen, can you do a white paper? And I want to know how waste to energy works all over the world, how it would work in New York, what it would mean for us. Can you provide me with that? And they did. And I was able to use that to take waste to energy off the chart. And so I contacted NRDC. I asked for something that our communities across the city needed. We didn't have the resources, we didn't have the technical expertise, and they were able to do that. That's really different from NRDC coming into our community and taking on that fight. When we were starting to work to defeat the siting of the power plant, NRDC came in and met with the power plant company and said, don't worry about UPROSE, we'll handle them. And we found out about that. We threatened to protest in front of the NRDC. We said, we'll do that. The news would love it. We will do that. Because you were supplanting local leadership. The power plant, the fight against the power plant was something that was started by our young people. They worked on that fight for 3 years. The fact that they were able to defeat the siting of a power plant was powerful and transformational. Why would you take that from them, right? So there is a way of doing it right, and then there's a way of not doing it. And we have managed to do that with a variety of environment, and we have had these sit-downs with them just this past year in Wisconsin, in California, in DC. That's just this past year. These sit-downs on how to do this in a way that makes sense. And in all of these organizations, there's folks like you that want to use those resources that that institution has and that expertise to advance the agenda in a community. And you can. And the process really is what dictates that, how you do that. So we've had very successful relationships. With NYPIRG, for example, NYPIRG helped us with Article 10, legislation to basically that addresses the siting of power plants. Very successful with them. So we've had good and bad, but we're committed to making it work because it's in the interest of our communities.
I actually am working for Greenpeace to do that. So when I moved to DC, the Environmental Justice Partners, so the Energy Action Coalition puts on something called Power Shift, and they have been tagged as the hub of the youth climate movement. There are a small number of environmental justice organizations within Energy Action Coalition, and then some youth arms of mainstream environmental organizations. We have the Sierra Student Coalition, you have the Greenpeace Student Network. The PIRGs were part of the coalition, but they would not sign on to the anti-oppression principles, and so they were
New York PIRG. I know about the other PIRGs.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like New York PIRG has it better. We have a better sense of what their role is. And so the Energy Action Coalition, they served as a re-grantor, using like the access that NWF, the National Wildlife Federation, the Sierra Club has to these funders to bring in this pot of money and then re-grant. And that sounds all lovely and beautiful, but what we saw is that even within that effort to like share resources, the bigger environmental groups were still getting more money. And so there is still that tension. And these are, younger people that had good intention, but when the shit hits the fan, they're looking out for their homies. They're looking out, well, Jenna, we don't want to fire Jenna. We'll give the Sierra Student Coalition more money. It's like, they're not producing as much. We have somebody, Candy Mossett is in Indian country organizing, and she's going between South Dakota and North Dakota, but you're only giving her a third of what you're giving the Sierra Student Coalition. Get out of here. And so that was a big tension. And what I did before I left Energy Action Coalition was create a specific budget for environmental justice work. And so that was like, this is a commitment. At the very least, after you re-grant money to partners, there's going to be additional money for EJ specific work, right? And now I'm at Greenpeace, and I'm helping them launch something called the Movement Support Hub, which is a interdepartmental team of staff that's working in two tiers. One is an internal tier to challenge and transform the organizational culture, and that does involve trainings for the current staff, and then working with HR to physically transform the organization and bring in people. But one thing is, when you're committed to social justice, it's not about diversity, because you can just pick up a black or brown person off the street. They have no framework or analysis, and they're probably just as bad as 3 white males, right? Because now you have a co-signer. You have, well, we have the black person or the brown person in the room. It's like, but if they're not committed to social justice, or that's not the framework that they operate from, it really doesn't help. And then there's the external tier, and that's actually my favorite part, and that's opening up the resources that Greenpeace has, whether it's research support, whether it's action support, communications, media support, whatever community groups need from us, that's what we're trying to offer, right? And really being careful about ensuring that we're not patronizing and we're like, hi, I think you can use some research support. It's like, no, how do we also like empower folks to be able to do the research themselves? Lean on Greenpeace for sure. And then also offering fiscal support, because that's really, and I tell this to environmental organizations all the time, if you're serious about working in solidarity with EJ and CJ communities, where is your commitment to putting down some dollars to that? Because it's not like you're going to hire a diversity coordinator on staff and that's it. No. So what we're doing is we're offering, and our budget is small compared to the budget of the rest of the organization, but it's $50,000. And so what we've been doing with that $50K is offering mini grants to organizations or small environmental justice groups. Our priority is environmental justice and climate local groups. So 60% of our time and resources are going to that. 30% are going to networks of these small groups, so like the Climate Justice Alliance, the NEJA, the Summit, like things that are happening on a bigger scale, but that are driven by the EJ and CJ leadership. And then 10%, the remaining 10% is for broader movement-wide things. So like we realized that some of the things that are happening around KXL are still being led by 350, even though they've had to be checked and they've had to recognize the Indigenous Environmental Network's role. And now they're like, there was a time that at rallies, they were trying to pull Indigenous people off of the stage because they were taking too much time at the rally. And so that, it sucks. It sucks to have to think that. It's like, wait, you've had 5 white males talk, and these are the only Indigenous voices from the front lines, and you're like trying to bring in the like hook? Get out of here, you know? But that's what we see. We see that a lot, right? And so to answer your question, you know, it is about what monetary commitment can your organization make, and making sure that there's no fire hoops that organizations have to jump through to get that money, no strings attached to get that money. It's just basically we are recognizing that as white-led organizations, foundations favor us. How do we use that privilege to close the resource equity gap?
So I'm going to say that the money is really important, but it isn't just the money. I'm just going to add, UPROSE is the lead organizer for the New York City Climate Justice Youth Summit. And last year we had 750 young people of color come. And the reason we organized that was because we saw that all over the country there were young white folks that were studying climate change, and that our young people weren't part of the leadership. And we needed to create a space where they would have an opportunity to do that. EAC offered us funds to go to Power Shift. We felt that our community was the real Power Shift. And we felt that unless our young people were part of the decision-making process, not just ours, but young people of color, that they weren't going to be coming in, scholarshiped in to be part of somebody else's agenda. We felt that we didn't want them to fight to be at the table, because my generation had to do that. And because we're intergenerational, we felt, why should another generation have to do that? Why do they have to keep fighting to be at the table when they can actually just create their home? So we didn't send New York City to Power Shift, because we created the New York City Climate Justice Youth Summit. And it was a way of sending a message that things have changed. And so we need the resources, that's true, because we are under-resourced. That's no joke. But it's about how decisions are made, how much people are willing to give, how much power they're willing to give up and share, you know? Because that's really what environmental justice is about, people speaking for themselves. The first Power Shift conference, we sent a young person to, he contacted me, said there are workshops on environmental justice being led by white young people. Now, the young people in our community are organizing. There are trees all over the neighborhood before the 1 million tree thing that they made sure were there. They've changed the landscape of our community. Why can't they, shouldn't they be leading these workshops? Isn't there something from them that white youth can learn? You know, we should be able to learn from each other. So for us, it's about power. It is, and the resources are really important. This resource came out of a conversation with the head of Greenpeace, Greenpeace, a meeting that we were at, and he just really opened up his whole heart and really thought about Greenpeace having to move in a different direction. And so he basically set the tone for Greenpeace to start moving in a very different direction. And now Lily gets to be there and do this really cool stuff. And she's EJ straight up, right? So, but this guy was in a meeting and he was listening to all of us and he was like, that's what we gotta do. So it happens, but the longer it takes, the harder things are going to be. And because Sandy was just the other day, you know. So anyway, but resistance for us is resilience. And so we will resist any effort to try to define for us what the agenda is. We will resist that. And it doesn't matter if our people are not part of creating that agenda. We're just not going to, like I said, be passive recipients. So.
A question there?
Yeah.
Well, quick testimonial on the question. I went to an UPROSE youth event in, I don't know, last summer or something.
You look familiar.
From Brooklyn.
Oh, yes.
And I was just blown away by the numbers of young people who, come out to this event and who are knowledgeable on some level of, about the issue. So my question then is, can you briefly say how it is that youth get attracted to UPROSE, or UPROSE attracts youth to its work?
So we love your organization, by the way. We do. We invite you to everything. I know who you are now. How we do that is we talk about power. We tell them that they need to feel like they're not being talked to, like they're not being controlled, that they're an integral part of decision making when they see that their engagement results in something that is addictive. So, for example, the young people that first came to UPROSE and stopped the siting of the power plant, they stopped the siting of a power plant the size of 3 football fields. What do you tell them after that? They have no power? They did that. You go to Sunset Park, and you can cross the street now, 4th Avenue, because the median has been expanded. Our young people facilitated that process. They did that, right? There's a waterfront park in Sunset Park that was going to be put in Bay Ridge. Nobody knows that UPROSE put a young person in every circle, and they said, move it to Sunset Park. Why are you giving Bay Ridge more open space, right? They did that. And so if they feel like they are driving change and they're learning how to testify at hearings, they're talking to the press right now, you know where they are right now? They're supposed to be here, to be passing out leaflets on the People's Climate March, and they found out that there is a Puerto Rican Day Parade in the Bronx. And so they all went, and I'm talking Dominicans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, all of them went over there to leaflet because they know that Muévete is going to be in the Bronx, and Muévete has a conference, and they want to get the Muévete folks to come to the New York City Climate Justice Youth Summit. So I'm watching it on Facebook. I'm watching the feed. They're like, oh, we got to go there. That's the more strategic place to be, right? So
it's a youth word of mouth kind of.
Yeah, but they are provided with training. They're provided with guidance. They're provided with opportunities to grow, to exercise leadership. We don't romanticize being a young person any more than we romanticize being a poor person, because we were once young and we were once poor, right? So if they're not right, we tell them, listen, that's not the way to go about that. Think about this. The beauty of intergenerational relationships, there's a lot of things that are good about it. But one of the cool things is that because they have guidance and support from people who are older, they make progress a lot faster. They don't have to make the same mistakes we made. If young people, see, this is a country where generations are pitted against each other. And so you've got young people saying it's youth-led, right? And they have no rhythm for people who are older, and older people wanting to hold on. And younger people discriminating against older people, saying make up the space and move on, it's our turn. There's a lot of competition. But in our people, from our nations, from the places that we have parties where you've got somebody 80 dancing with somebody 4 years old. That's our culture. Intergenerationalism for us is a beautiful thing. And we honor our elders, right? So we've created a power structure at the organization that reflects that. And they love it. And you can talk to them. You don't even need to talk to me. Just talk to them directly. Why do they keep coming? They don't ever have to age out, right? Because we're intergenerational. And so what happens is that you've got an older cadre of young people training the next coming up. So just recently, if you're on Facebook, you saw Junior Justice, and you had the teenagers teaching the little kids how to plant cilantro, how to do all of that stuff. And then you've got the older ones that are in college organizing the summit. It frees me up to come here and talk to you. You know what I mean? It's all good. And they understand power. They understand that we say to them, even academically, their grades go up. We say, every time you cut class, every time you don't take care of business, somebody in another neighborhood who doesn't look like you is going to become your boss, going to determine where you live, how you live, and how much you get paid. You want to give that up? And they're like, oh, no, that's what that's about. It's about power. So I don't know what else to tell you, but I think you should talk to them. I think you should just ask them directly. Because right now they have a thing now, it's divestment and zero waste. And yesterday they spent the day learning about anaerobic digesters. How to build them. They want to know how to build them. Because we have a climate justice hub, which is a block by block organizing effort to take part of Sunset Park off the grid. And so zero waste is a piece of that. So they went off to learn about anaerobic digesters. How old are they? 16, 17 years old. Do we cream? Do we take the student who's an A student? Absolutely not. Are they an A student by the time they get out of UPROSE? Yes. Yes, they are. Do we tutor them? No. What they do is they reclaim their life and their future. Am I proud of that? Hell yeah. Talk about it all the time. It's what gets me up in the morning. Yes, yes.
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning. I'd hammer in the evening. All over this land. I'd hammer out danger. I'd hammer out warning. I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters. Whoa, listen, that if I had the bell, I'd bring it in the morning, I'd bring it in the evening, all over this land. I'd bring out danger, I'd bring out a warning, I'd bring out love between my brothers and my sisters. Oh, listen.